At 4 a.m., I stood alone at the airport check-in. My suitcase was packed, my heart was full, but my name wasn't on the list. He had given my place to his girlfriend. I didn't cry, I didn't shout. I just walked out into the cold, my hands shaking. They said I was too old, too slow, too outdated, but they had no idea what I was about to uncover. And once I did, nothing was ever the same again. I had never been the kind of woman to chase luxury, but Monaco had always meant something to Henry. Years ago, he circled it in a travel magazine and said, "Someday." He never got there. Life got busy. Then it ran out. So I made a promise to myself. 5 years after losing him, I would go. Not alone. I wanted to bring family, fill those empty seats with laughter, maybe get one photo where I wasn't the only one holding the camera. I didn't need much. Just that one moment. Just that one place. So I planned it. 8 days, a boutique hotel overlooking the water, a walking tour through the old district, and one dinner cruise on the last night. Total cost came to $37,000. I paid it in quiet. I didn't want them to feel like it was a transaction. This was a gift, a memory, a bridge. Travis, my son, was the first to respond to my invitation. He said he was proud of me for doing something bold, said he could help with logistics. I smiled. Maybe this was it, a real shift. Since Henry passed, Travis had grown distant, not cruel, just blurred, like a radio station that no longer came through clearly. He offered to book the group flights, said it would be easier that way. I agreed. A week later, I got a text from him that said, "Flights handled, details coming soon." No emojis, just period punctuation. I read it twice, trying to imagine the tone. Then I let it go. The guest list ended up small, just the people who mattered. Me, Travis, his girlfriend Brielle, a few family friends from Boston. I chose my suite carefully, requested a room with a view that faced the harbor. Henry would have liked that. Travis suggested we host one small dinner before the trip, just to align expectations. I thought it was a lovely idea. I cooked my late husband's favorite dish and laid out old photos in a soft spiral on the table. Brielle showed up 40 minutes late, wearing a fur-lined coat and heels that didn't know winter. She didn't acknowledge the meal, just gave me a side hug and said the house was cute. During dinner, she asked if there'd be activities for younger energy on the trip. Said she didn't want the vibe to feel too elderly. Her eyes flicked toward me like punctuation. Travis laughed. He said she was joking, but nobody else was laughing. She picked up the guest list I'd left by the door and started circling names in pink ink. She paused when she reached mine, then drew a slow line through it. She glanced at me and grinned. "Oops, just kidding." My hand went still on my wineglass. I didn't say a word. That night, I didn't sleep. I pulled out Henry's old watch and laid it beside my pillow. I remembered the day he gave it to me, our 10th anniversary. No diamonds, just his name etched in the back. Solid, lasting, like him. The days moved faster after that. Packing lists, passport checks, travel insurance. I handled it all. I even paid for Brielle's expedited renewal when hers didn't arrive in time. She never thanked me. Still, I let hope anchor me. Maybe this was how it all shifted. Maybe once we got there, everything would feel right. I packed a soft green cardigan for the flight, one Henry always said made my eyes look like spring. I laid my suitcase by the door the night before and set my alarm for 3:45 a.m. I wanted to be early. I wanted to show them I was ready. At 4:05, I locked the front door behind me and stepped into the cold. What happened at the airport that morning cracked something in me I didn't even know was fragile. But I'll get to that soon. Before I do, I want to know something. Have you ever paid for a dream, only to realize you were never meant to be in it? Brielle had this way of talking that always felt like it was almost meant for you. Almost, but never quite. She'd lace compliments with quiet corrections, praise my independence, then mention how impressive it was for someone my age to handle things alone. At first, I smiled through it. I'd known worse. I'd been through worse. I could outlast a few condescending remarks and awkward silences. The dinner had barely settled when Brielle began offering suggestions for the itinerary. She wanted to swap out the historic walking tour with a rooftop DJ set. She said we should cancel the afternoon museum stop and book a beach club instead. Travis nodded along like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. When I mentioned the tour had already been prepaid, Brielle shrugged. She said it was probably refundable, and that I could check. Not we. I. I started to feel like a travel coordinator instead of the one hosting the trip. Later that week, I got an email from the hotel confirming the room upgrades Travis had requested. My room was no longer listed as Ocean View. I stared at the line of text for a long time. I never approved the change. I called the front desk to clarify. They told me my suite had been reassigned to Brielle and Travis due to a special request from the travel coordinator on file. That coordinator was Travis. I didn't confront him. I didn't want to believe what it looked like. The next evening, I joined them for dinner at Travis's place. A simple night, supposedly. But Brielle had printed out custom place cards, one for every guest, except mine. She acted surprised when she noticed, said she thought I had RSVP'd no. Her voice rose half a tone, like she was genuinely embarrassed. Travis handed me a folded paper napkin with my name scribbled on it in pen. I sat down without a word. Halfway through the meal, she started asking casual questions about retirement. She wondered aloud whether I ever felt lonely, whether living alone in Vermont was isolating. She said her mum was already planning for assisted living, and she was 10 years younger than me. Then she leaned toward me with a smile and said, "It must be hard not having a man around." I sipped my water and focused on the lemon slice floating inside it. Anything not to look at her eyes. After dinner, Brielle pulled out her iPad and began showing everyone a vision board for the trip. The images were all glittery cocktails, white outfits, sunset yoga, and some kind of yacht brunch party. There was no trace of Henry, no nod to what the trip was meant to be. She turned the iPad to me and said, "I hope you don't mind if we modernize things a bit." I stared at the collage of strangers in swimsuits and thought about Henry's journal, where he once wrote that the best view in the world was a quiet harbor at dusk. The next morning, Travis sent a group message with final reminders. He included packing tips, airport meetup details, and meal preferences. I scrolled to find my name. It was there, under the guest list. But something felt off. That afternoon, I stopped by his place to drop off copies of everyone's travel insurance forms. Brielle opened the door. She took the folder from my hands and said she would take care of it. I asked where Travis was. She said he was on a call. I stood there for a second, waiting. She didn't move. I turned to leave. As I walked away, I heard her phone buzz. Then I heard her voice. She said my name. Said it in a way that felt like punctuation again. Not a sentence, just a period. That night, I didn't eat dinner. I sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled faintly of Henry's old cologne. The house was quiet. The wind outside pressed against the windows like it wanted in. I thought about all the years I spent showing up, school recitals, soccer games in the rain, college visits where I carried the bags, every birthday cake with his name in frosting, every sacrifice tucked into silence. Now I couldn't even keep my sweet, my name on a place card, my seat at a table. But I stayed quiet, because some part of me still hoped I was wrong, still believed there was a misunderstanding, still wanted to give my son every chance to act like my son. The real shock hadn't come yet, but the edges were already starting to crack, and I was beginning to feel the cold air creep in through them. I got to the airport at 4 in the morning, just as planned. The air was still thick with night, quiet except for the occasional roll of luggage wheels and soft airport music, barely audible over the hum of the terminal. I wore Henry's favourite travel sweater, the navy one with the worn elbows. The collar still held a trace of cedar from our old closet. My suitcase rolled steady behind me as I walked toward the Emirates counter. Everything had been checked the night before: passport, boarding pass, travel insurance. I had the itinerary printed and folded neatly in the front pouch of my carry-on. Travis had said we were all meeting at gate 18. I texted him when I got through security, just a quick heading in. No reply. I didn't think much of it. He was probably helping Brielle with something. That had become a full-time job lately. At the counter, I handed the attendant my ID and confirmation number. She typed something, paused, then asked me to wait. Her fingers moved across the keyboard again. She double-checked the spelling of my name, then she stepped away to speak with a colleague in a low voice. My stomach tightened. She returned with a careful smile and said my reservation did not appear to exist. Not under Whitmore, not under the confirmation code, not as a companion guest. Nothing. I pulled up the email on my phone and held it out. She looked at it, then looked back at her screen. She asked if I had spoken to the trip organizer recently. I opened my mouth, closed it, then nodded once. She handed my ID back gently, like something had been broken and she didn't want to be the one to say it. I walked to a quiet corner of the terminal and called Travis. He picked up after a long ring. I said I was at the gate. He paused. I heard Brielle's voice in the background, muffled. Then he said calmly that they had made a few changes. Brielle, he explained, had been under a lot of pressure lately. Her job was burning her out. She needed a break. Creative renewal, he called it. The trip would mean more to her right now. He said he thought I would understand. I did not speak for several seconds, not out of restraint, but because the breath had left my lungs like someone knocked it out with a fist. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the gate that was never mine to begin with. He continued, said the room would be used. The costs would still be covered. Nothing would be wasted. He said it like that was a kindness. I told him my name was not on the ticket. He said that was correct. He said Brielle had my spot. Then he added that he hoped I could use this time to rest. Maybe even take a little retreat of my own. He said I deserved it. The call ended. I don't remember pressing the red button. The rest of the world moved on around me. A flight to Miami was boarding across the hall. A couple argued softly about overhead bin space. Somewhere a child was crying for a snack. I stood still in it, completely still. Then I walked toward the exit. No taxi lines yet. I called Marcia. She answered on the second ring, voice groggy but warm. I said, if it wasn't too much trouble, could she pick me up? She said yes without asking why. When she pulled up, I got in without a word. She looked at me, then reached over and squeezed my hand. We drove in silence for a while. The sky was beginning to lighten. Morning pressed against the glass like a secret trying to get in. Back at home, I unpacked, slowly, deliberately, every folded blouse, every rolled sock. I placed the sweaters back into the drawers, zipped the suitcase closed, and slid it into the hall closet. I didn't cry. I made tea, Earl Grey, 2 sugars, no milk, the way I always had it when Henry was alive. I sat in the kitchen with the mug cupped between my palms and listened to the wind scrape past the windows. The house was silent, but not empty. My thoughts filled every room. I remembered Travis as a boy, the way he used to ask me to stay until he fell asleep, how he would hold my pinky finger with his whole hand. I had memorized the curve of his forehead when he leaned in for bedtime stories. And now, I had been edited out of a trip I designed, erased from a list I created, replaced in a room I booked, removed from a plan that was mine to begin with. He hadn't even told me in person. That was what cut deepest. Not the ticket, not the cost, not the change of plans. The quiet decision to take me out of the picture, as if I wouldn't notice, as if I didn't matter. I sat there for a long time, letting the tea go cold. When the sun finally broke through the window and painted the wall behind me in gold, I stood up and poured the rest of the mug down the drain. Then I walked into the study and opened the drawer where Henry kept our records. I didn't know what I was looking for yet, but I knew the silence had said enough, and it was time to listen. Marcia pulled up in her old blue sedan, still in her pajamas and winter coat. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. I got into the back seat and buckled myself in like a child being picked up after school. The sky hadn't shifted from black to grey yet, and the quiet was a relief. Not the silence of being ignored, but the kind of silence that holds you. She handed me a thermos. The tea inside had gone lukewarm, but I held it with both hands anyway, like it could keep my soul from shaking. The car rolled past the empty roads, gas stations still dark, convenience stores just starting to light up their signs. I stared out the window and tried not to think, but of course that never works. I kept seeing the check-in counter, the look on the attendant's face, the way she had leaned back, confused, and asked for my name again, the way my voice cracked the second time I said it, the way my knees went soft when Travis answered the phone. All of that happened less than an hour ago, and yet it already felt like it belonged to another lifetime, like it had happened to someone else. Back home, the snow in my driveway had started to crust into patches of grey ice. Marcia walked me to the door, and I thanked her in a whisper I wasn't sure she heard. She didn't ask anything, just squeezed my hand before getting back into her car and driving away. Inside, the air was colder than I remembered. I turned the heat up but didn't take off my coat. Instead, I walked to the kitchen and filled the kettle, even though I still held the thermos. I watched the water boil and tried to match my breath to the soft hiss of the steam. Then I took my suitcase upstairs. I unpacked slowly, folding everything back into the drawers like I had never planned to leave. I took the navy scarf Henry gave me for our 35th anniversary and wrapped it around my neck. Not because I was cold, just because. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the closed closet door. It had Henry's suits inside. I had never moved them. I didn't need to. The scent had faded over time, but I still imagined it. We had talked about Monaco once, back when we still had plans that reached beyond the grocery list. Henry had said he wanted to see the sea from the cliffs. He liked the idea of old Europe. He liked the idea of taking me somewhere I'd never have to cook. That was before the hospital visits, before the long nights holding his hand while the machines beeped, before I kissed his forehead goodbye and walked out into a life that no longer had his voice in it. That was 5 years ago. This trip wasn't supposed to be for fun. It was supposed to be a way to mark something, to hold space for what we had. And maybe, deep down, I thought if I brought Travis along, If I covered the costs and let him take the lead, maybe he'd finally see me as more than just the old woman who forgot to update her phone's software. But all I became was a name deleted from a list. I stood and went downstairs. My hands moved before I knew what they were doing. I pulled out the tea tins, arranged the cups, straightened the cushions on the couch. Busy work. Distractions. I lit the candle Henry never liked and let its cheap lavender scent fill the room. And then, for no reason at all, I opened the hallway cabinet. It wasn't where I kept anything urgent, just old photo albums, some important files, and one brown folder I hadn't touched since after the funeral. Inside that folder were our estate documents. I flipped through them absent-mindedly, not even sure what I was looking for. That's when I saw it. 2 copies of the same document, one on top, the other clipped beneath. The top one was clean, printed last year, and had my signature on it. It named Travis as the sole director of the Whitmore Memorial Fund. There was a note in handwriting I didn't recognize. Signed with consent. Witnessed. The second one, older, had Henry's signature at the bottom next to mine. That one named me as the trustee, and clearly stated that any changes would require written permission and the presence of both parties. My heart started pounding, not with panic, but with something colder, something still. I remembered last spring when I had shoulder surgery and was on strong medication. Travis had helped manage the mail. I had signed a stack of documents he brought into my room. I was groggy. I hadn't read them. I sat on the floor with the folder in my lap and stared at both versions of the same paper. My fingers went numb. Not from shock, from recognition. This was never about the trip. This was about removing me from more than a plane seat. It was about rewriting what Henry and I had built together. Silently, neatly, efficiently. I didn't cry. Not then. I didn't even speak. I just sat there, the scarf still around my neck, my coat still buttoned and holding 2 pieces of paper that told me exactly what I had become in my son's world. Optional, disposable, replaceable. And in that moment, something inside me settled, not in defeat, in clarity. By late afternoon, the snow outside had turned to slush, thick and dirty at the edges. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the 2 copies of Henry's trust document spread in front of me. The ink on the new one hadn't even faded. It looked fresh, clean, cold. My name was gone from every line that had once carried it. That wasn't the part that hurt the most. What settled deeper was the line that said, "Authorized with knowledge and consent from Eleanor Whitmore." I traced that sentence with my finger, slowly, over and over, like maybe if I touched it enough times, it would dissolve. I thought about calling Travis, not to accuse him, not even to confront him. I just wanted to hear him admit it out loud. But my hand wouldn't move toward the phone. I wasn't ready to hear the tone he would use, the condescending calm, the way he would shape his voice like he was explaining simple math to a slow student. Instead, I poured a second cup of tea and carried the documents into the living room. I placed the real one, the older one, into a new envelope and slipped it under the bookshelf drawer. It was the drawer Henry used to keep his old pipe collection. It hadn't been touched in years. The fake one I placed back into the folder, the one Travis had left for me after the surgery. Neat, rehearsed, unchallenged until now. Later that evening, I walked down to the mailbox. The cold stung at my cheeks, but it cleared my head. I hadn't realized how long I had been inside the house, wrapped in the same coat, the same scarf, carrying the same ache. Inside the mailbox was nothing but a grocery flyer and a letter from the bank. I opened it on the porch, under the porch light. It was a transaction report. The card Travis used for travel bookings had been tied to my name. The statement listed every expense: 5 plane tickets, a luxury suite in Monte Carlo, a private car service, meal reservations at the marina, even a floral arrangement marked Brielle Welcome Gift. Total, $37,809. The payment was pending under my account. I folded the paper neatly and slid it into the inside pocket of my coat. Then I stood in the dark and looked out at the streetlights, flickering in the fog. One of them had gone dim, barely holding on. I knew how that felt. The next morning, I called a law office in town. Not my usual one, a place I had never used before. I asked for an appointment, and they said they could see me that afternoon. The office was small, tucked between a dry cleaner and a pet supply store. The receptionist didn't blink when I walked in. I must have looked like any other grandmother, a little tired, a little quiet, a little too early. When the lawyer came out, he introduced himself as Malcolm. He looked barely older than Travis. I handed him the folder with both documents. I asked him to take his time, to read them carefully and tell me the truth, not the polite version. He read. He compared. He adjusted his glasses. Then he looked at me and said exactly what I already knew. The newer document was valid, unless I could prove I hadn't been aware of what I was signing. He asked if I remembered that day. I told him I remembered the pain in my shoulder more than anything else. I had been medicated, tired, weak. He nodded. He didn't offer false comfort. I told him I wasn't there to file a lawsuit. I just wanted to understand the extent of what had been changed. He explained everything. Travis now had full control over the Whitmore Memorial Fund. He could redirect grants. He could change its mission. He could even dissolve it, if he saw fit. The only limitation was that the funds had to remain within non-profit parameters. Malcolm paused, then added that technically, Travis had no legal right to use that fund to pay for a vacation. But the booking had come through my personal card. Travis had probably never expected me to check. Before I left, I told Malcolm I appreciated his time. He asked me one last thing before I walked out. Did I want to try and reclaim the fund? I said no. I told him I didn't want to spend my final chapters in a courtroom. I didn't want to turn Henry's memory into a legal battle. I wanted one thing only: to make sure that what Henry intended, what we had built together, was not erased. Malcolm nodded. I could tell he understood. Maybe not from experience, but from the way some people learn by watching others fall. That night, I sat alone in the dark, no music, no light, except the lamp near Henry's old reading chair. I held the bank statement in one hand and the original trust document in the other. The pages didn't tremble. I did. And slowly, something in me began to rise. Not rage, not revenge, just a deep, steady resolve. If they had quietly erased me, I would quietly write myself back in. But not through them, through something that could not be signed away. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the two documents in my lap like they were pieces of a puzzle that didn't belong in the same box. One was the original will, with Henry's tidy handwriting in the margins, appointing me as the sole trustee of the Whitmore Memorial Fund. The other, a more polished version with digital type and my own signature at the bottom, said otherwise. It was dated last year, during the months when I was on heavy pain medication after my shoulder surgery. I barely remembered anything from that time, certainly not signing away something that had meant so much to Henry. Something that, in his words, was meant to protect the vulnerable and the unseen. I stared at the signature. It was mine, but it felt like it had been pulled from another version of myself. One too drowsy to ask questions, too trusting to suspect her own son. That morning, I made an appointment at a law office in the next town over. I didn't want anyone local. I didn't want this to become gossip or pity. I needed someone who had no stake in my story. The office was tucked behind a bakery. The receptionist was kind, but I could tell she looked at me like I was just another old lady confused about her paperwork. But then the attorney stepped out, a woman around Travis's age, firm handshake, no-nonsense tone. She took the two documents, read them silently. I could feel the weight of every second that passed. When she finally looked up, her voice was calm but direct. Yes, the authority over the fund had legally shifted to your son. No, it could not be reversed easily. Yes, your signature was binding. She paused. The odd part, she said, was that the amendment had been notarized by someone in California, and I had never left Vermont. She flipped through the papers again and then said, almost gently, that the fund had paid out a large expense recently. The retreat in Monaco, $37,000. The transaction cleared under a joint account. My account. I felt my breath catch. So I had paid for the trip. Still, even after they replaced me with someone else, even after they left me standing at the airport, I looked her in the eye. I told her I didn't want to sue. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted to understand. I just needed the truth. I needed to know when I became invisible to the people I raised. She asked if I wanted to reclaim control over the fund. I told her no. I wanted to honor what Henry really wanted. And that didn't include dragging his name into a legal battle. It meant doing what he always did. Listening to the truth, then acting with quiet precision. As I left the office, the fall air felt heavier than usual. I walked down the street, past the bakery, past the tiny bookstore Henry used to stop at. My thoughts weren't spinning anymore. They were lining up, forming something solid, something unshakable. Back home, I opened a fresh notepad. No laptop, just pen and paper. I made a list. Not of what had been taken, but of what I still had. My name, my voice, my clarity, my story. I pulled out the retreat itinerary Travis had sent months ago. I scanned each line, each booking, each payment, and then I picked up the phone and began cancelling, one by one. The hotel, the yacht tour, the dinner reservations. I didn't shout. I didn't explain. I just removed my name, and with it, the money attached to it. That night, I didn't sleep much, but I didn't cry either. I watched the moonlight move across the kitchen floor. I thought of all the nights I stayed up with Travis when he had fevers, the times I held his hand before his first job interview. I thought of Henry's laugh when he said our son would grow up to move mountains, but might forget who first taught him to walk. The next morning I made tea and sat on the porch. My phone buzzed once, then again. Missed calls from Travis. I let it ring. Let the silence answer for me. Because sometimes silence is not absence, it is presence. It is the sound of someone finally drawing a line, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The morning after my visit to the law office, I opened my laptop and pulled up the email folder Travis had created months ago. He had called it Project Whitmore Legacy. The title, at the time, had made me proud. Now it just felt theatrical. Inside the folder were all the confirmations: the hotel in Monaco, the private transportation from the airport, the sailing excursion Henry had once dreamed of. Every detail had been arranged, everything except my presence. I began with the hotel, a luxury suite, booked under my name, billed to my account, scheduled to begin that very night. I called the front desk. The woman who answered greeted me warmly. She said they were expecting me. I told her there had been a change in plans. I asked to cancel the reservation. She paused. There would be a penalty. I said that was fine. I didn't need the room anymore. I moved down the list. The yacht company was next. They had charged half up front. I asked to forfeit the deposit. The woman on the phone tried to persuade me to reschedule. I said I wouldn't be returning. I ended the call before she could ask why. It took nearly 2 hours to undo what had taken Travis weeks to put together. Each cancellation was a small unraveling of a web I had never agreed to spin. When I finished, I sat back and let my hands rest in my lap. Then I went further. I logged into the joint account I had once set up for Travis when he started college. I had left it open, thinking it might be useful in emergencies. Over time, he had turned it into his personal planning fund. The trip to Monaco, gifts for Brielle, even subscription services for design magazines, all quietly withdrawn from that account, under my name. I closed it. Then I changed the password on my main financial account. I removed his access, unlinked his email, and notified the bank to flag any activity connected to his name. There were no dramatic messages, no notifications sent, no confrontations. I simply took back what was mine, without noise, without spectacle. That evening, the first post went up. Brielle's Instagram was full of soft pastels and curated joy. The photo showed her standing in front of the Monaco harbour, arms stretched wide, sunglasses perched perfectly on her head. The caption read, "Inspiration begins with letting go of the old. No more chains, no more limits." I read it once, twice. Then I closed the app and left my phone face down on the counter. The next morning, the second post came. It was a video. Travis panning across a private beach, narrating the retreat with a tone I hadn't heard from him in years. Polished, detached, corporate. He ended the video by saying, "This trip marks the start of something bigger. We are honoring a legacy, but we're also creating our own." I sat in silence. I thought of Henry, the way he used to hold my hand while we walked the garden path behind our house. The way he spoke about legacy as something rooted in compassion, not performance. He had never wanted a monument. He wanted people to feel less alone. I stood up, walked to the closet, and pulled out a sweater of his I had kept. It was too large, soft, with age. I wore it like armor. In the kitchen, I made tea. I watched the leaves swirl before settling at the bottom. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply breathed. By noon, I began to receive missed calls. Travis, then Brielle, then Travis again. The messages were brief. "Something's wrong with the hotel. We can't access the dinner reservation. The tour company says the card didn't clear." I didn't respond. I imagined them pacing around their luxury suite, trying to make sense of the disruption, the unraveling, the absence of control. But I wasn't interested in watching them panic. I wasn't looking for revenge. I just wanted them to understand what silence could do. Later that night, I returned to the garden. I walked the familiar path alone. The wind was soft, and the sky had just begun to shift into dusk. I sat on the bench Henry had built, my tea still warm in the thermos beside me. I whispered one sentence into the quiet. "This is enough." And for the first time in a long while, it truly was. The evening air settled soft and cool as I opened the door to my home. The weight of the day still pressed on my shoulders, but I carried something lighter within me, a quiet resolve, a flicker of hope that had long been buried beneath layers of hurt. I wasn't sure what had prompted the idea at first. Maybe it was the loneliness that gnawed at me during the long nights. Maybe it was the realization that the pain I carried wasn't mine alone. Whatever it was, I had decided to open my doors to a few women like me, women who knew what it was to be unseen, unheard, and unwanted. I called a handful of names from an old notebook, the women I had met through volunteer work, those who had once trusted the world and had it all quietly taken away. Some had lost homes, some had been pushed from their families, others had simply faded into shadows of neglect. 6 showed up. Each one arrived with a story heavier than the last. Their eyes held the fatigue of years spent fighting for scraps of dignity. Their hands trembled as they carried bottles of wine, jars of preserves, homemade bread. They came bearing their wounds, wrapped in kindness. We gathered in the living room. The fire crackled gently in the hearth. The walls held pictures of my family, but in that moment, it felt less like a memorial to the past and more like a sanctuary for the present. I poured wine slowly, carefully, filling each glass as if it were a small ceremony. The first woman spoke softly about her daughter who refused to visit. Another told of a son who never called, who had taken her savings without a word. Their stories spilled like a river breaking through a dam. The pain was raw but shared, the grief both personal and collective. At some point, laughter found its way between tears, the kind of laughter that comes from being truly seen and understood, from knowing you are not alone in the dark. I told them about Henry and the trip we had planned that was stolen, how I had been replaced by a stranger, and how it had hurt more than I thought possible. They nodded. Their eyes shone with the recognition of wounds mirrored. One of them, a woman named Margaret, pulled out a small box from her bag. Inside were letters from her grandchildren. She had been written out of their lives after refusing to sell her house to her son's new family. I pulled from my pocket the worn photo of Henry and me by the lake. We were young, smiling without worries. I handed it to her. She smiled, a slow smile that reached deep into her eyes. She said, "This is the kind of legacy they will never take from you." The evening stretched on, stories intertwined with memories and new dreams. Ideas surfaced about creating a place, a real place, where women like us could come for support, for friendship, for strength. A place where we weren't defined by what we lost, but by what we could still give. Before they left, we joined hands in a circle, not just as strangers brought together by pain, but as sisters bound by shared survival. I looked around the room and saw faces that held both scars and resilience. I realized then that the Whitmore Memorial Fund might have slipped from my grasp, but I still had this connection, this family. As they stepped into the cold night, I stood by the door and watched the streetlights shimmer on the wet pavement. My heart felt lighter than it had in months. Inside, the house no longer felt empty. It held the warmth of those who had come, and the promise of those who would return. I sat by the fire and picked up a journal Henry had kept. Flipping through the pages, I read a passage he had written years ago. "Legacy is not measured in wealth or property, but in the lives touched and the love shared." I closed the book and whispered to the flickering flames. I may have been forgotten by some, but not by those who truly mattered. And for the first time, I felt ready to build again. The first morning after the gathering, I stood in my kitchen staring at the empty mugs on the counter. Lipstick stains, bits of crumbs still clinging to the saucers, the soft scent of lavender and wine still hung in the air. It wasn't the mess that held me still. It was the presence, the warmth, the feeling that something had shifted. I thought about what Margaret had said before she left, that maybe we didn't need the world to recognize us. Maybe we just needed each other. That thought stayed with me as I cleaned up. I folded the worn tablecloth, set the chairs back in their places, and ran my hand along the side of the dining table like it was a relic of something sacred. I felt a seed growing, something small, but certain. By noon, I had pulled out Henry's old desk calendar. On a fresh page, I scribbled 4 words. The Whitmore Circle begins. I didn't have a grand plan. There was no mission statement, no logo, no social media page, just a few names and a deep need to make space for women like us. Women who had once built families, only to be locked out of the very homes they helped create. I reached out to the 6 women from the night before. All 6 answered without hesitation. We met again the following Friday. This time, I set out mugs with names written on little strips of masking tape. I made soup, something hearty and warm. We sat on cushions and folding chairs, and for the first hour, we just listened. No one interrupted. No one corrected. We let each other speak into the silence without fear. Doris, who had once worked as a school librarian, brought a notebook filled with poems she had written when her daughter stopped speaking to her. Joanne, a retired nurse, shared stories of taking care of patients who treated her with more dignity than her own son ever had. Louise talked about gardening again for the first time since her granddaughter told her she was too slow to be around. None of us said it out loud, but we all understood. These weren't just stories. They were our battle cries, our quiet revolutions. The third Friday, we voted to meet every week. We decided to each bring something we used to love, something that once belonged to the part of us that felt alive. Music, recipes, newspaper clippings, photos of road trips before cell phones, and bitterness. It wasn't long before other women began to ask if they could come. Friends of friends, a neighbor who overheard us laughing on the porch, a woman from the local food co-op who had overheard Margaret talking about it over a bag of oranges. We didn't say no. There was no application, no registration form. If you showed up with a story and a heart full of cracks, that was enough. The name stuck. The Whitmore Circle. It started as a nod to Henry, but the meaning shifted. It no longer belonged to the fund that had been taken. It belonged to us, to the late bloomers, to the forgotten matriarchs. I cleared out the back room of my house, dusted the old upright piano, and placed chairs in a circle. I found an old lamp with a cracked base and made it our centerpiece, a symbol that even broken things can shine. Some nights we talked, some nights we cried, some nights we said nothing at all, and just listened to the soft ticking of the clock. The silence became its own kind of music. We never talked about fixing each other. That wasn't the point. We weren't projects. We were people who had been bent, but not broken. By the second month, Joanne offered to teach basic first aid classes. Doris started hosting a small writing group on Wednesdays. Louise brought seeds from her garden and offered to help plant flower beds at the homes of anyone who wanted colour in their yard again. It became something real, something rooted, and we kept it quiet. No press, no announcements, no banners across town. We weren't building a brand. We were building a place to breathe. I bought a corkboard from a thrift store and pinned a handwritten note at the top. We are not done yet. One afternoon, I walked to the post office and opened a small P.O. box under the name Whitmore Circle. The woman behind the counter asked if it was for a business. I smiled and said, "No, it's for women who need somewhere to be." Back at home, I sat by the window and looked out over the trees. The leaves were beginning to fall. The sky stretched wide and pale above the hills. I picked up the old ledger where Henry once tracked his community legal clinics. I flipped to a blank page and began to write. Date, name, why they came. The entries weren't long, just initials and moments. JR needed to feel safe. LM hasn't laughed in weeks. BT no longer wanted to eat alone. It wasn't about documenting pain. It was about witnessing it, making it real, saying it mattered. I tucked the ledger away and turned off the light. As I sat in the quiet, I realized I had created something more lasting than money ever could. A small, flickering circle of warmth in a world that often went cold too fast. We were here. We were still here. And we were beginning again. The house was quiet that afternoon. The kind of quiet that wraps around your shoulders like a shawl. I sat at my writing desk near the window, the one Henry and I picked out years ago from a little store in Montpellier. The desk still had a faint smell of cedar. I hadn't used it in a long time, not for anything personal. Bills, notes, to-do lists, sure. But this was different. I laid out a piece of cream-colored stationery, smoothed the edges, and picked up my pen. At first, I just stared at the page. There were too many things to say, too many ways to start. I closed my eyes, took a breath, and let my hand move. Dear Travis, I'm not writing to make you feel guilty. That isn't my goal. I don't want to punish you, or ask for anything to be returned, or dredge up arguments we never had the courage to speak aloud. I'm writing because there's a space between us now, one you created, and I need to define that space with my own words before it swallows the rest of me. The pen scratched softly as I wrote. My hand trembled once, but I kept going. I understand, in some fractured way, why you did what you did. Maybe Brielle filled your ears with ideas. Maybe the pressure of legacy and expectation made you believe you had to take charge. Maybe you truly thought the fund would be better in your hands. But you made that decision without me, without conversation, without respect. That absence of dialogue, that was the deepest cut. I stopped to look out the window. The lake shimmered in the afternoon light. Ducks glided across the surface, effortless. I returned to the page. Do you remember how Henry used to say that the way a person handles power tells you everything? Not just about their plans, but about their heart. He trusted you, not blindly, but fully. And so did I. When I signed that paper during my treatment, I believed it was an insurance update, something routine. I trusted you not to use my condition as a moment of advantage, but that's exactly what happened. I paused. The words felt heavier now. I'm not asking for the fund back. You've already made it yours, in your way. But I found the original version, the one Henry wrote by hand, the one that named me the steward, not because I was his wife, but because he believed I would guard the intention behind it. I folded that version and placed it in an envelope, not to send, just to keep close. I went on. I want you to know something important. I don't hate you, but I no longer recognize you as the person I raised. That boy who once brought me dandelions in spring and wiped his sticky fingers on my jeans. He's gone. And maybe that's how life works. Maybe children grow into people their parents can't fully know. But what you did wasn't just ambition. It was a deletion, a quiet rewriting of who I am in this family. I closed my eyes again. The hurt pressed behind my ribs like a dull ache. But I kept writing. You may never understand why I chose silence instead of confrontation, why I didn't call or demand an explanation, why I walked away from that airport and never looked back. You may never understand that silence is not weakness, it is choice. My choice to preserve what little dignity I had left. The sound of wind brushing through the trees carried through the cracked window pane. I listened for a moment, then returned to the letter. I have begun something new, something small, something sacred. You won't find it in newspapers or announcements. It isn't about proving worth or reclaiming what was taken. It's about building again, with the parts that are still whole. I didn't mention the name. He didn't deserve to know. Not yet. Maybe never. I ended the letter like this. Take this not as a goodbye, but as a marking, a line drawn not out of anger, but out of necessity. I still love the version of you that once believed in fairness. I carry her, the mother I was to you, with compassion. But from this moment forward, I live by my own definition, not yours, not Brielle's, and not Henry's memory alone. I wish you well, even as I walk away from your shadow. I signed it simply, Mum. I read the letter once, then folded it slowly. I didn't seal the envelope. I placed it in the bottom drawer of the desk, beneath a stack of blank pages. Some things do not need to be delivered to serve their purpose. That evening, I lit a candle on the windowsill, the same one Henry used to light during long winter nights. I watched the flame flicker and dance. It didn't ask for an audience. It just burned, quietly, surely. And in that quiet, I felt something return. Not a reconciliation, not a clean resolution, but a clarity, a knowing. I had written the words I needed to write, not to change anything, but to make peace with what would no longer change. By the time autumn settled over the hills, the leaves outside my window had turned a brittle gold. Every morning, the fog lifted slower from the lake. The air smelled of firewood and rain. And inside me, something had shifted too. Not loudly, not all at once, but in the way pain starts to loosen its grip when you stop expecting it to leave. I hadn't heard from Travis. Not a message, not a letter, not even a note to acknowledge the birthday he used to mark with flowers and coffee on the porch. But I wasn't waiting anymore. That ache had passed through me like a long season, and I had weathered it without breaking. Instead of silence, I focused on the small things that filled my new life with steadiness. Morning began with the hum of the kettle. I returned to making my own breakfast, even if it was just toast and apricot jam. I walked more. I wrote. Not about them, not anymore, but about myself. For the first time in years, I was the center of my own page, and I showed up at the center with all my wear and softness and scars. One afternoon, I received a letter with no return address. The handwriting was unfamiliar, blocky and tense. I opened it carefully. It was from Brielle's sister. Her words were short, but there was something raw beneath them. She wrote that she had seen what happened that day at the airport. She had also seen what followed, how Travis and Brielle spent the money like it would never run dry, how they changed houses twice, then filed for bankruptcy before summer ended. She said none of this to hurt me, only to explain that sometimes the ones who take without asking are punished not by the people they hurt, but by the lives they build on lies. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside the one I had written to Travis. I didn't need justice in the way most people think of it. I didn't want their ruin. What I had wanted was space, and now I had it. In that stillness, I began something else. With the help of a few friends, women I had met through the local community center, I quietly started a small foundation. It wasn't grand or flashy, just a circle of support for older women navigating grief, transitions, and the brutal loneliness that can come from being left behind. We met twice a week. Sometimes we baked together. Sometimes we sat with coffee and didn't say much at all. But we listened. We listened with the kind of silence that healed instead of hollowed. It was in those gatherings I found a new rhythm. One of the women, Marla, had lost both her sons to addiction. Another, Geneva, had been abandoned by her daughter after a falling out over inheritance. Each woman carried a wound that hadn't closed, but they also carried a strength that didn't demand applause. We didn't need fixing, we just needed witnessing. And in giving that to each other, we became something more resilient than restored. We became whole in a way that didn't require repair. The woman I was before the Dubai trip had been someone who placed her faith in the structure of family, who believed that sacrifice and love would always be enough. The woman I was now didn't stop loving, but she no longer gave herself away piece by piece in the name of being needed. Instead, I held the warmth I created. One evening, as the sky burned orange across the lake, I lit the small candle I kept on the mantel. It had become a ritual, like a quiet nod to the version of me who once sat alone, wondering how everything fell apart. That version of me had written a letter she never sent, had walked away without demanding answers, had planted seeds in silence. And now, in the soft glow of that flame, I saw what had grown. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't triumph. It was peace. It didn't shout. It didn't ask to be seen. But it stayed. Every day. Steady. Gentle. Mine. The lake was still that morning. No breeze stirred the water. Even the birds seemed to pause mid-flight, as if the world itself was holding a breath just for me. I stood at the end of the dock, wrapped in my favourite cardigan, the one with worn sleeves and pockets deep enough to hold memories. A year had passed. 12 months since the trip that never was. Since the airport moment when I realised I had been erased in silence, replaced without warning. Since I stepped out of their lives without burning bridges, only letting them rot quietly behind me. And in that time, life had not rushed in to fill the emptiness. It had moved slowly, gently. I had learned to live not with what I had lost, but with what I had left. And what I had left was enough. The foundation I started with the other women had grown beyond anything I imagined. We called it the quiet table, a place where women sat side by side with their stories and sorrows and didn't need to explain themselves. There were no lessons or requirements. Only presence. We had women from all over town. Some had lost husbands. Others had been abandoned by children they once raised alone. One woman, Bernice, had never married, but had devoted her life to a sister who no longer remembered her name. Each of us had given until there was almost nothing left. Now, together, we began giving back to ourselves. I taught a few cooking classes again, not for money, just to pass on something warm. People still remembered my lemon loaf and rosemary chicken. It was funny how food lingered in memories more kindly than words. And I liked that. I liked that I could still create comfort without explaining the ruins I'd come from. One afternoon, I received a voicemail. Travis's voice, hesitant, flat. He said he had been thinking, that he wasn't calling to explain, just to say he was sorry. He didn't know how to fix things. He just wanted to say he hoped I was all right. I didn't call him back. Not out of anger, not even pain. Just clarity. There was nothing to return to. That version of mother and son had ended in silence at gate 14. What remained were two people learning how to live with who they had become. I had forgiven him, quietly, for myself, not for him. I forgave him so I could stop checking the phone, stop dreaming of apologies dressed in gifts or guilt, stop imagining a version of love where I was always the one holding the weight. As the sun rose higher, light spilled across the dock. I sat down slowly, feeling the worn wood beneath me. In the distance, laughter drifted from the community centre. Someone had brought their grandkids for a visit. I smiled. There were still cracks in me, but they no longer bled. They had become part of the grain, part of what made me steady. Whole did not mean untouched. It meant holding the broken pieces with care. And that is what I did. Every day, quietly, steadily. That morning, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small shell I had picked up the day I walked away from the airport. It was smooth, pale pink, chipped on one side. I had kept it not as a symbol of loss, but of the moment I chose myself. I tossed it gently into the lake, not to forget, but to remember I had survived, and I was still here. If this story spoke to something quiet inside you, something you've carried alone, know that you are not the only one. So many of us have walked through silent heartbreaks and kept moving anyway. I would love to hear your thoughts, your reflections, or just your presence in the comments. Sometimes, even a small moment of recognition can be a beginning. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here.